Time can't erase. A retired police dog's return to its first partner. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. A soft golden glow stretched across the quiet countryside as autumn whispered its arrival through the rustling trees. Jack Carter sat on his worn-out porch chair, a steaming cup of coffee in his calloused hands. He wasn't watching the sunrise. He wasn't listening to the birds. His eyes were locked on the photograph between his fingers. The edges of the photo were curled, worn from years of being handled. It showed a younger version of himself standing in uniform with his arm resting on the back of a strong, alert German shepherd. The dog's dark brown eyes were sharp, always searching, always watching. Shadow, his partner, his protector, his friend. Jack exhaled slowly, rubbing his thumb over the image of Shadow. He could almost feel the dog's presence beside him, the warmth of his fur, the steady breathing, the quiet reassurance that no matter what happened, they were a team. But that was years ago, before Jack left the force, before they were separated. He took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth seep through him. Does he even remember me? The thought had haunted him for years. Shadow had been reassigned to a good home after Jack's retirement. It was supposed to be the best thing for him, a stable life, a peaceful home. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that somewhere Shadow might be feeling that same emptiness he felt. Maybe it was foolish to hold on to the past. Maybe it was time to let go. Jack sighed, setting the photograph on the porch railing. But as he stared at it, a sharp ringing sound broke the silence, pulling him from his thoughts. His phone. Jack reached for the phone, frowning at the unfamiliar number on the screen. Few people called him these days, even fewer from numbers he didn't recognize. "Hello," a hesitant voice answered on the other end. "Is this Officer Carter?" Jack's spine stiffened. It had been years since anyone had called him that. "Who's asking?" he said cautiously. "My name is Lisa Thompson." The woman's voice was soft, uncertain, but there was something beneath it, an edge of concern. I have Shadow. He's been with my family for a few years now." Jack sat up straighter, his heartbeat suddenly loud in his ears. Shadow. He swallowed. "Is he okay?" Lisa hesitated. "That's why I'm calling. Lately, something's changed. He's been acting restless, whining at night, pacing the house. It's like he's looking for something, or someone." Jack's fingers tightened around the phone. A strange pressure filled his chest. Shadow had moved on. He had a family, a home. But if that were true, why did he sound so lost? Lisa's voice wavered. 2 nights ago, he started digging in the backyard. Jack frowned. "Digging?" "Yes, at first I thought he was just restless. But then he found something." Jack's pulse quickened. What did he find? There was a pause before Lisa answered, her words barely above a whisper. "A badge." A chill ran through Jack's spine. His breath caught in his throat. "What?" "Name is on it," he asked, though deep down he already knew. Another pause, then, "Yours." The world around him seemed to freeze. His old police badge, the one he had thought was lost, forgotten. Somehow, Shadow had found it, unearthed a piece of their past. Jack closed his eyes, gripping the armrest of his chair. A dog might forget. A command, a trick, a scent, but a bond like theirs, that wasn't something time could erase. Jack swallowed hard. "Are you sure it's mine?" "Yes," Lisa said. "It has your name, your badge number. It was buried deep, like it had been there for years." Jack's hands clenched into fists. Shadow had carried that badge with him. He had buried it, hidden it away. But something had made him dig it up now. Why now? Lisa's voice softened. "Officer Carter, I think he's looking for you." Jack didn't speak. He couldn't. He could picture it too clearly. Shadow, pacing restlessly, searching, digging, determined, as if he had remembered, as if some part of him had never stopped waiting. Jack exhaled sharply, gripping the phone tighter. Somewhere deep inside, a truth was settling into place. Shadow hadn't forgotten him. Even after years apart, even with a new home, something inside him had pulled him back to Jack. Jack could feel his own walls cracking, the years of telling himself it was better this way, that Shadow was fine, that moving on had been the right choice. But now he wasn't so sure. Lisa's voice was gentle. "I don't know what to do. I just know that whatever he's searching for, he won't stop until he finds it." Jack's chest ached. Neither would I. He opened his eyes, looking at the photograph still resting on the porch railing. The past was calling, and this time he wasn't going to ignore it. "Where do you live?" he asked. Lisa gave him the address. Jack stood, grabbing his coat. His old truck sat in the driveway, a little rusted, a little worn, just like him, but it could still get him where he needed to go. Jack climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key, and pulled out onto the road. He didn't know what he would find when he got there, but one thing was certain: it was time to see Shadow again. The hum of the truck's engine filled the quiet evening air as Jack Carter navigated the suburban streets. The sky was painted in soft hues of orange and pink, but Jack barely noticed. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel, knuckles white from the pressure. His heart was pounding. Shadow. After all these years, he was finally going. To see him. Would his old partner recognize him, or had time stolen what they once had? Jack swallowed the lump in his throat, forcing himself to focus on the road ahead. Lisa's house was just up the street, a modest home with a neatly trimmed lawn and a white picket fence. It looked like the kind of place where a dog could be happy, safe, loved. And yet something had changed. Jack pulled into the driveway and shut off the engine, exhaling slowly. He sat there for a moment, gripping the key in the ignition, staring at the house through the windshield. Inside, Shadow was waiting. Jack ran a hand over his face, steeling himself. He had spent years convincing himself that letting Shadow go was the right decision, that the dog deserved a peaceful retirement. But now, standing on the threshold of their reunion, doubt gnawed at him. Would it be selfish to hope Shadow still remembered him? Would it hurt more if he didn't? Jack stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel driveway. As he approached the front door, memories clawed their way to the surface, memories of another night long ago when Shadow had saved his life. The drug bust had gone terribly wrong. A warehouse filled with smoke, gunfire flashing in the dark, adrenaline roaring in his veins. Jack had moved cautiously through the shadows, Shadow at his side, his sharp ears twitching at every sound. "Stay close, buddy," Jack had murmured. Gripping his weapon, Shadow had obeyed as he always did, loyal, unwavering. Then, chaos. A gunshot. A sharp yelp. Jack's heart had stopped. He had spun around, eyes searching, terror gripping him like a vice. Shadow was down, his powerful body sprawled across the cold concrete, a bullet lodged in his protective vest. His breathing was shallow, but he was alive. Jack had abandoned all sense of protocol, dropping to his knees, shielding Shadow with his own body as bullets rained down around them. He hadn't cared about anything else, only saving his partner. Because Shadow wasn't just a police dog. He was family. That night Jack had carried him through the storm of gunfire, refusing to leave him behind. Now, years later, Jack stood on another battlefield, the doorstep of a house that wasn't his, about to face the one soul who had ever truly understood him. Would that bond still be there? The front door swung open, revealing a woman in her early 40s with tired but kind eyes. "Officer Carter?" she asked hesitantly. Jack nodded. "Just Jack now." Lisa gave him a small, knowing smile. "Come in." Jack stepped inside, inhaling. The scent of fresh coffee and warm cinnamon. The house was cozy, lived in. Family photos lined the walls, a child's toys scattered across the floor. This was Shadow's home now. Lisa led him to the living room, motioning for him to sit. "Thank you for coming. I know this is sudden." Jack waved it off. "Tell me what's going on." Lisa hesitated, then sighed. "He's been different lately, restless, pacing by the door at night, whining. Then he found your badge in the backyard. Jack frowned. My badge? Lisa nodded. It was buried deep in the dirt, but he dug it up, like he was looking for something, or someone. Jack swallowed hard. Shadow had found a piece of their past, a sign, a message, or just an old dog grasping at a memory. Lisa gestured toward the back door. He's outside. Jack hesitated. A strange foreign fear gripped him. What if Shadow had moved on? What if the bond they had once shared was gone? Taking a steadying breath, he pushed open the door. The backyard was wide, bathed in the fading light of dusk. A gentle breeze rustled the grass, and near the fence, sitting quietly, was Shadow. Jack's breath hitched. The once powerful canine was older now. Grey dusted his muzzle, his body leaner than before. He wasn't the same strong, relentless police dog Jack remembered, but his posture was still alert. His ears twitched, his nose flared. Then, as if sensing something, Shadow lifted his head. Jack froze. For a long, aching moment they just stared at each other. Shadow's amber eyes studied him, searching, uncertain. Then, a low whine. Soft, questioning. Shadow took a hesitant step forward. Jack's heart pounded. Did he remember? Jack swallowed past the lump in his throat. His voice was barely above, a whisper. Shadow. The dog flinched, his ears perked higher. His tail gave a tiny flick. Something flickered in his eyes, a memory clawing its way to the surface. Jack knelt, his voice breaking. It's me, buddy. And then, everything shattered. Shadow let out a deep, mournful whimper, the kind that carried years of longing. His body trembled. Then, in a flash, he closed the distance between them, pressing himself against Jack's chest, burying his head in the familiar scent of his old partner. Jack's arms wrapped around him instinctively, his fingers digging. Into the thick fur, his throat tightened. I missed you too, boy, Shadow whined, pawing at Jack's arm, his whole body shaking. Years apart, a lifetime of distance, but in this moment, none of it mattered. Lisa watched from the porch, her eyes misty. I've never seen him like this. Jack ran a hand over Shadow's back. He never forgot. His voice was rough with emotion. Even when I thought he had. Lisa hesitated. But he's been with us for years. He has a family here. Jack's heart clenched. He knew what she was saying. Shadow had built a new life, one that didn't include him. Would it be fair to take him away? Or would it be cruel to ignore what was still between them? Lisa knelt beside them, running a gentle hand over Shadow's fur. Maybe he doesn't need to leave. Maybe he just needs to know he hasn't lost you. Jack exhaled. Yeah. He nodded slowly. I'd like that. Lisa smiled, handing him a leash. Then take him for a walk, Officer Carter. I think he's been waiting for you. Jack clipped the leash onto Shadow's collar. The old dog's tail wagged, slowly. At first, then with growing excitement. Jack chuckled, rubbing Shadow's head. Come on, partner, let's go. They walked through the quiet streets, side by side, just like they used to. The years melted away. Shadow trotted beside him, ears high, eyes bright, his loyalty unwavering. Time had changed many things, but some bonds, no matter how tested by time, could never be erased. Jack stood motionless on Lisa's back porch, his breath shallow. His boots felt rooted to the ground, as if moving any closer would shatter the fragile moment. Only a few feet away, standing in the middle of the yard, was Shadow. The old canine police dog held himself still, ears perked, amber eyes locked onto Jack with an intensity that sent a chill through him. Lisa shifted beside him, her voice hesitant. He might not recognize you. Jack swallowed the lump in his throat. He had told himself the same thing over and over on the drive here, bracing for the worst. But standing here now, facing the dog that had once been his shadow, his protector, he couldn't stop the quiet hope stirring inside him. Had time erased everything between them? Shadow didn't move. His body remained tense, muscles coiled as if he were assessing a threat. There was no wagging tail, no excited bark, just that careful, guarded stare. Jack clenched his fists. He had imagined this reunion countless times, but never like this. He had met Shadow when the dog was just a pup, full of energy and promise. They had trained together, bled together, survived together. And when the bullet had nearly taken Shadow's life, Jack had been the one to carry him out of danger. That bond had once been unbreakable, but now standing here it was as if they were strangers. Jack's chest ached. Had Shadow really moved on? Jack exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think. If words wouldn't work, maybe memories would. His fingers brushed against his pocket, feeling the small familiar object inside. He hesitated for a moment before pulling it out. A worn silver whistle, its surface dulled from years of use. Lisa frowned. "What's that?" Jack's voice was barely above a whisper, a sound he never forgot. He lifted the whistle to his lips and blew. A sharp, distinct note sliced through the quiet evening air. Lisa inhaled sharply, her eyes flicking to Shadow. The dog flinched at the sound. His ears twitched. His body stiffened. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened, and then Shadow's nostrils flared. His tail gave the smallest flick. His amber eyes widened, scanning Jack's face, searching. Something cracked in his expression, as if a long-buried memory had surfaced. Jack barely had time to react before Shadow bolted. 1 second, Shadow was still. The next, he was sprinting toward Jack with a force that nearly knocked him backward. A deep, whimpering cry escaped Shadow's throat, a sound raw with longing, relief, and recognition. Jack barely had time to brace himself before Shadow pressed against him, his large paws reaching his chest, his head burrowing into the crook of Jack's neck. The dog's body trembled, as if the weight of years apart had finally caught up to him. Jack's breath hitched. He buried his face in Shadow's fur, his voice breaking. "You remember, don't you, buddy?" Shadow whimpered again, his tail wagging wildly now, his body vibrating with joy. Jack laughed through his tears, holding the dog close. "I missed you too." Lisa wiped at her eyes. I've never seen him like this." Jack ran a hand down Shadow's back, feeling the strong, steady heartbeat beneath his palm. "Neither have I." Shadow didn't pull away. It was as if he was afraid Jack would vanish again if he let go. Jack knew in that moment what Shadow had been waiting for all these years. Not a new home, not a new family. He had been waiting for Jack. Lisa knelt beside them, running a gentle hand over Shadow's fur. "I think he's been waiting for you all this time." Jack swallowed hard. "But he has a home here. He has you." Lisa smiled, her eyes glistening. "And maybe that's not enough for him anymore." Jack looked into Shadow's eyes, searching, but there was no hesitation there, no uncertainty. Just a deep, unshakable trust. Jack had spent years wondering if Shadow had forgotten him, but now he knew the truth. Some bonds never break. The fading sunlight cast long shadows across the yard, but Jack and Shadow remained where they were, together, just like they had always been. Jack exhaled, stroking Shadow's head. "Let's go home, partner." Shadow gave a happy bark, pressing closer as if he understood every word. No more waiting, no more distance. At long last, they were home. The air was thick with unspoken emotions as Jack sat on Lisa's porch, the wood creaking beneath his weight. The fading glow of the sunset bathed the yard in gold, casting long shadows over the grass. Shadow lay curled at Jack's feet, his body relaxed, but his eyes, those sharp, intelligent amber eyes, never left him. He watched Jack the way he had during their years on duty, always vigilant, always waiting. Lisa sat beside them, cradling a steaming mug of tea. She glanced between Jack and Shadow before breaking the silence. "I can see it." Jack turned to her. "See what?" She smiled, a soft, knowing expression. "The way he looks at you, the way he's calm when you're here, it's like he's been waiting for this." Jack swallowed, his throat tightening. He had seen it too. The way Shadow leaned into him without hesitation, the way his tail flicked at Jack's voice. A quiet, unshakable trust remained despite the years apart. But what did it mean? Lisa exhaled, rubbing her hands together, as if trying to warm them. "I need to ask you something, Jack." Jack braced himself, his hands tightening around his knees. "Go ahead." She hesitated for a moment, then asked, "If you had the chance, would you take him back?" The question hit harder than Jack expected. He had thought about it, of course he had. Countless nights. He had wondered if Shadow still remembered him, if they'd ever be together again. But Shadow had a home here. Lisa had taken care of him, given him a life outside the Force. Would it be selfish to take him away from that? Jack ran a hand over his face. "I don't know," he admitted. "I want to, God, I want to, but I don't want to take him from a good home." Lisa studied him for a long moment. Then she simply said, "Maybe the choice isn't yours to make." Jack frowned. "What do you mean?" She nodded toward Shadow. "Maybe you should let him decide." That night, Jack lay in Lisa's guest room, staring at the ceiling. Sleep was impossible. His mind was tangled with memories, late-night patrols, training in the rain, Shadow's unwavering loyalty through every mission. A soft sound outside the door made him pause. A quiet whine. Jack sat up and swung his legs over the side of the gi. "Frasi!" When he opened the door, Shadow was there, curled up against the threshold. His ears perked, his tail thumped against the wooden floor once. Jack knelt, his chest tightening. "Hey, buddy, what are you doing out here?" Shadow didn't move, just nudged Jack's hand with his nose before resting his head on his knee. Jack exhaled, stroking the dog's fur. He didn't need words to understand. Shadow had already made his choice. The next morning, Jack found Lisa in the kitchen, sipping coffee. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting warm patterns on the floor. Before he could say anything, Lisa glanced up and smiled. "I heard him." Jack rubbed the back of his neck. "Lisa, She held up a hand, stopping him. "Jack, I love Shadow. He's been part of my family for years, but I think I was just keeping him safe until he could find his way back to you." Jack's throat tightened. He glanced down at Shadow, who sat obediently by his side, looking up with unwavering trust. Lisa reached over and scratched behind Shadow's ears. "He belongs with you, Jack. He always has." For the first time in years, Jack didn't hesitate. He crouched down and murmured, "Come on, partner." Shadow stood immediately, his tail wagging, ready to follow. Loading Shadow into the truck was like stepping back in time. The familiar weight of paws settling into the passenger seat, the soft sigh as Shadow curled up, it felt so natural, like no time had passed at all. Lisa stood on the porch, watching them with a bittersweet smile. "Take care of each other," she said softly. Jack nodded, gripping the steering wheel. "Always." As he pulled out of the driveway, Shadow rested his head on Jack's lap, just like he used to after long shifts. Jack chuckled, running a hand through the dog's fur. "Guess some things never change, huh?" Shadow let out a content sigh, his tail flicking once. No, some things never did. The drive home was long, but Jack didn't mind. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He glanced at Shadow, who stared out the window, ears perked, eyes alert, ever the watchful protector. Jack smiled. "Looks like retirement's over, buddy." Shadow gave a small bark as, if in agreement. They weren't just partners, they were family, and family always found their way back to each other. Jack's house had been quiet for too long, but that night, as he sat on the porch with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, things felt different. The silence was no longer empty. It was peaceful. Shadow lay beside him, watching the stars. It reminded Jack of the old days, when they would finish a shift and sit just like this, soaking in the quiet after a long day. Only now, there were no sirens, no danger, just two souls who had found their way back to where they belonged. As the wind rustled through the trees, Jack reached down and scratched behind Shadow's ears. "You waited for me, didn't you?" he murmured. Shadow turned his head, licking Jack's hand before resting his head against his knee. Jack chuckled softly. "Yeah, I waited for you too." The night stretched on, peaceful and still. Some bonds, no matter how much time passes, can never be erased.